Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. This is a real joy, and it's a real pleasure to be here with Laura. She and I have the same editor at Penguin, and really have kind of palled around a little bit when our books first came out. So it's fun to see her again and share the stage. What I'd like to do is kind of tell you the story behind the story of Queen Sugar, which is also the story of my life as a writer. Because I think a lot of times when people think about writers, you know, a lot of times people tend to think that this whole journey is easy. And I don't know about other folks, but I have had quite a time. And I always think that it's fun to really be pretty transparent and tell you what my experience was like bringing Queen Sugar out into the world. So really, my story starts in 1997. Queen Sugar, as Kelsey told you, is the story of an African-American woman who leaves Los Angeles after she learns that she has inherited some sugarcane land. And she packs up and she takes her daughter down to this tiny town in South Louisiana. But the first question people always ask me when they find out that I'm a native Californian, a Southern Californian originally, was, how in the world did you come to write a book set in Louisiana? How did that happen? Well, the truth is that my dad, he passed away, but he is from Louisiana. He's from this small town near the Texas border called Elton, Louisiana. And he was born in 1937, so that was really the height of segregation. So he really had a very complicated relationship with the South and with Louisiana. On one hand, he loved it, and he loved the food, and he loved the people. His whole family, to this day, still lives in Louisiana. But because of the time that he was born, he really looked at California as the land of opportunity. And so the night of his high school graduation, he packed his bags. He had maybe 15 or 20 bucks in his pocket, and he caught a ride to California with a woman from his town who needed someone to help her with the driving. And that's the way he got to California. And as a young boy, the train, the Union Pacific train actually ran through this little town where he lived. And he would beg his mother to put him in a box, because at that time, you ordered chickens from the Sears catalog or whatever in a box. And so he used to beg his mother to put him in a box with a little bit of food and put him on the train so that he could go to California. So the night of his high school graduation, he picked up and he left. And he headed to Los Angeles, and really, he didn't look back. Well, what that meant for my sister and myself, I'm the oldest of two. Growing up, we did not know Louisiana at all. My dad would call his mother once a week on the phone, and so maybe we would, talk to my grandmother. Occasionally, she would write letters to us, but she didn't like to fly, and she didn't like, so she would have to take the train or the bus to come out and see us, and that's a long trip. So for years, the only way we knew anything about Louisiana was this box of food that my grandmother would send to my dad every Christmas, because again, he's a Louisianan. He loves his food. And he was very particular about the sausage that he would put in his gumbo, which he would make every Christmas. So my grandmother would send this box, and in this box every year she would have homemade pecan pralines. She would have dried shrimp. She would have boudin sausage. Now, who knows what boudin is? Okay, all right. So I'm right. I'm in the South. I don't have to tell you. Usually when I'm in San Francisco, I have to explain what boudin is. Okay, so my grandmother would put smoked sausage, and she would put boudin in this box. Now, this was not 2005, 2010. This is 1984, before Federal Express overnight shipping, right? So she would put this box of food in the US mail. And it would take a week, 10 days to get to our house. And so by the time this box arrived, all of that smoked sausage, all that boudin would have rotted. And it would arrive on our doorstep. And my mother, who is not from the South, she's from Detroit, would forbid my dad from even opening this box in the house. He would have to take it around to the backyard. So for years, the only thing I knew about Louisiana was that I associated it with this box of reeking, stinking, rotten meat that would arrive on our doorstep every Christmas. Well, for years, even though my dad left Louisiana, he would always go back and he would take his mother on a road trip. He would only go back to Louisiana for 3 days, 4 days tops. He would always go in April or May before it got too hot. And he would fly in and he would take his mother on a road trip. So he would land and he would say, "Mother, where do you want to go?" And she'd say, "Well, baby, I want to go to Grand Isle. Or I want to go to New Orleans, or I want to go to Little Rock, Arkansas." So wherever my dad could drive to and get back from in 3 or 4 days, he would go, and he would take my grandmother. Well, when I was in college, and for the few years after I graduated, I started going on these trips. I don't know why I started going on these trips, to be honest, but I think it must have been curiosity. And I would go on these trips with my dad. I would sit in the back seat, and my grandmother would sit in the passenger seat, and my dad would drive. And what they would do, they would just talk about their lives. And I know that Craig Johnson, who spoke earlier this morning, talked about, he really learned about storytelling from his family of storytellers. Well, I listened to that and I thought, I have that same experience, because it was really as I sat in the back of the car and listened to my dad and my grandmother talk about the old, their time in Louisiana and the old days in Louisiana, that I really became a fan of storytelling. I really came to love and know Louisiana. It was really through those road trips. Well, in 1997, my grandmother passed away. And at this time, I had graduated from school. I was working in my dad's business, and I dreamed of becoming a writer. Every day after work and on the weekends, I would go home and I would write these stories, but I wouldn't try to get them published or anything. I would just write, thinking, oh, if I only had the courage to say I was a writer, I would, pursue this. Well, in 1997, I had written a story that ended up being part of Queen Sugar, and it was about a young man and his son, and they were living in this car and they were driving around Los Angeles. I wrote the story, and very much like Craig Johnson this morning, I put it in a drawer. Well, in 1997, my grandmother passed away, and my husband and I went to her funeral. And again, I'm a Westerner. I'm a California native. I had never been to a Southern Baptist funeral before in my life. And I tell you, my mind was blown. My grandmother had been like the founding member of her little church in this tiny town. That church couldn't have been, it was probably half the size of this auditorium. It was tiny. But because she had been such a big personality in her town and knew not just everybody in her own town, but everybody in all of the surrounding towns, when she passed away, people came to her funeral. And there must have been 400 people in this tiny little church. And they were spilling out all into the yard around the church. And I had never seen anything like this in my life. That funeral lasted for 4 hours. And I sat in the front, in the family pew, and I watched this parade of people come through and pay their respects. And all of a sudden I realized, holy cow, this is the town that those characters that I wrote about all those years before, this is where they're from. And all of a sudden, this little story that I had started to write took on a whole new life. So I went back and I started writing. And so from 1997 until 1999, June 15th, 1999, I started working on this story. Well, June 15th, 1999 is what I consider my first, that is really my official birthday as a writer, because that was the day I walked into my dad's office. He sold aluminum, by the way. He sold aluminum to the aerospace and aircraft industry, which is great if you're interested in aluminum, but it is soul-killing if secretly you want to be a writer. And I had tried to hold on, and I tried to be that good daughter who was going to take over the family business, and I hung on for about 11 years. And by June 15th, 1999, I couldn't take it anymore. So I went into his office and I said, you know, Dad, I really do have to pursue this writing thing. And we'd kind of been around the bend about this a few times. And so this was not exactly a surprise. But I went in and I said, Dad, I've got to be a writer. I have this story I want to tell. And so he said, okay, you know, good luck. And I can remember driving across the railroad tracks because his business was in the industrial part of Los Angeles, just south of downtown. And there were railroad tracks and the Farmer John meat processing plant was just down the street. It was a really industrial area of the city. And I can remember driving across these railroad tracks thinking on one hand, yes, I've done it. I've broken away. I'm going to be a writer. And on the other hand, I was thinking, holy cow, what have I done? I have now taken this leap of faith, and I better get to work. So from June 15th, 1999, until 2005, I got to work on Queen Sugar, a book that eventually took 11 years to write. But for those first 6 years, I set the story in a fictitious version of the town where my grandmother had grown up, because honestly, that's all I knew of Louisiana. I knew this little town of Elton, which was so small that if you blinked, you would miss the turnoff. So I started writing this story, and for those first 6 years, it was set in this fictitious version of my grandmother's town. Well, any of you who know Louisiana know that, you know, there are different crops, different regions. And in my grandmother's region of the state, they grew rice and crawfish. Not particularly romantic crops, right? Not very interesting. And so those early drafts of my novel really were set in this tiny town where they grew rice and crawfish. Well, in 2005, my husband and I and our kids had moved up to San Francisco. And I had the good fortune of meeting another young woman who was from Louisiana. And our kids were in the same kindergarten class, and she and I became immediate friends because very much like my dad, who was the only member of his family to have left Louisiana and come west, my friend Stephanie Shea was the same way, but just a generation later. She was my age, but she had also left her family and come to San Francisco, and she was the only member of her family to have broken away. And so she and I immediately became friends, and we would talk about Louisiana. Well, that year, she invited us, my husband and I, to her birthday party. She was turning 40. We now say she was turning 20, but she was actually turning 40. And she was going to have this big blowout celebration in her hometown of New Iberia, Louisiana. I'd never heard of New Iberia before. But we decided we were going to go down for this birthday party. So remember, I'd been working on this novel for 6 years now. And that thing was, it was a monster of a manuscript. But I flew down a few days early because by this time I had also realized, well, I need to give my character Charlie a reason to leave her life in LA and go down to this little tiny town. And I actually have to credit my husband because he was the one who said, why don't you have her inherit some land? And I thought, oh, that's good. Okay, I can work with that. And so I had to find a crop for my character to inherit. And as I said, crawfish and rice were not particularly compelling. So I drove down, or I flew down to my friend's birthday party a few days early. And I actually hired a woman who gave these tours. Her name was Alice something. And she had this little advertisement on the web called Alice's Cajun Country Tours. And I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to do. So I called her. I said, you know, Alice, I'm a writer. I live in San Francisco. Would you please, can I hire you to take me around South Louisiana to do some research? Because I need to find a crop for my character. So Alice said, sure, come on down. So I flew down a couple days before my friend's birthday party started, and Alice and I drove around. And she lived in Crowley, Louisiana, if you know Crowley, which is actually kind of between my dad's town, which is farther west, and New Iberia. It's kind of right there on the border. Well, Alice drove me around for 2 or 3 days, and she took me to the Crystal Rice plantation. She took me to a sweet potato manufacturer. She even took me to a man's backyard garden. And I didn't know what I was looking for. I just thought, well, Natalie, you'll know when you find it. So after 2 or 3 days of this, I hadn't found anything. And Alice was saying, are you okay? Are you okay? I was saying, well, I'm looking for something, and I can't find this crop. And so I thanked Alice, because now people were starting to arrive for these festivities. And I drove to my friend Stephanie's house, and we're sitting on her porch. And she said, Natalie, how's the book going? And I said, well, to be honest, it's not going all that well, because I can't find a crop for my character to inherit. And she said very casually, well, my mother owns some sugarcane land. Why don't I drive you out there and you can see it? So I said, okay, fine. So we hop in the car and we drive down Highway 192 towards St. Martinville. And she pulls over into the middle of this sugarcane field. And this was the middle of July. And that cane was 10 feet tall, and it was swaying in the breeze, and those leaves were rustling, and the sky was blue. And I tell you, it was one of those moments that writers dream about, where all of a sudden you can see how the book you're writing, you can see how it's going to work. And I turned to Stephanie and I said, this is it. This is the crop I'm going to have my character inherit. So I went back, and all that weekend I was asking people, tell me about sugarcane, because immediately after I discovered that immediately after I decided that I was going to drop my character down into this new place, I realized I don't know anything about sugarcane. I don't know a thing. So it just so happened that the same weekend of this party, one of Stephanie's college friends, a wonderful guy named Rene Simon, was at this party. And at the time, Rene was a real live sugarcane farmer. And he came up to me and my husband, and he said, Stephanie tells me you're writing a book about sugarcane. If you have any questions, here's my card. I'm happy to help. So when I got back to San Francisco, I started calling Rene. And this is, August, September. I called him a couple of times. Well, remember, this is 2005. So what happens in 2005? Katrina, right? So Rene's crop is devastated. His mother-in-law, they had to move her from New Orleans out to their house in New Iberia. It was really a tumultuous time. But after I knew that Rene was okay and his family was okay, I started calling him with questions. And my questions would be things like this. Well, if my character doesn't have a lot of money, how would she be able to buy her equipment, or what would she need to buy? And Rene would tell me, and I would take notes, and I'd go back to my desk, and I would, write another scene or write another chapter. And then I'd call him and I'd say, how much land would be enough land that it's a challenge, but not too much land that it's unrealistic? Because at this time, I'm starting to think, well, I want people in Louisiana, if they know sugarcane, I want them to read this and say, okay, this is true. She didn't make it up, right? But if you don't know Louisiana, I wanted readers to feel like they'd been transported to this place. So I started calling Rene. First it was, once a week. And then it was once every few days. And then it was once a day. And then it was 3 or 4 times a day. This went on for about a month. And so finally, by the early November, Renee said to me one day, Natalie, you know, you really need to come down here. You need to see Louisiana for yourself. You need to see the harvest, because that was actually happening at the time. He said, you need to come down here and experience this for yourself. So I did. I booked a ticket and flew back down to New Iberia. I didn't even tell my family, my Louisiana family, that I was coming. And I started flying down to do research. And every time I would fly down there, and I would usually go 3 or 4 times a year for the next 5 years. I started going as often as I could, because what I realized was that I needed to really absorb Louisiana, South Louisiana culture. I needed to figure out not just the crop, not just sugarcane, but I needed to really digest that whole world that was so different from the world that I knew in San Francisco. So in 2009, I had been writing the book, and I thought I was finished. Because remember, at this point, I'd put in 10 years on this project. And I probably revised this book 10 or 11 times by this time. And I thought the book was ready. So I sent it out to agents, because as Laura will be able to attest, it's one thing to write the book. It's another thing to get the book out into the world. And part of that means that you have to find an agent. Well, I had a couple of agents who had heard about the book that I was writing, either from friends or they had heard about it from my writing program. And so I sent the book, the manuscript, to a few agents, just a few. Now, what I have to explain is that a lot changed in the publishing industry between the time I started dreaming of becoming a writer back in, the mid-90s to the time I was ready to sell this manuscript in the mid-2000s. Everything about publishing had changed. We'd had the financial crisis, right, that had turned publishing upside down. We'd had the invention of ebooks. There were no ebooks when I started publishing. When I started writing, there was no Amazon. There was no, there was no Kindles. None of that had happened. So by the time I got ready to look for an agent, everything about representation had changed. I had come of age at the time when if an agent saw a young writer that had promise, they would take you in, right? Because it was all about the long game. It was all about nurturing your career as a writer. Well, by the time I got ready to sell this manuscript or look for representation, agents really were all about the bottom line. They were really about, can we sell your book? That was it. So I started looking for agents, and I'd had some introductions. Some writer friends in San Francisco had offered to introduce me to their agents. So I sent the book off to 5 people, all of whom I'd had introductions to. 2 of those agents didn't even respond when I sent in the manuscript. No thanks, no nothing. 3 of them did respond, and 3 of them said, we love this book. We love the characters. We love the setting. We love the story that you're telling. We just don't love it enough to take it. Which is the equivalent of somebody telling you, we love you, we just don't love you enough to marry you. That's the way it felt for me. And one of those agents, who had kind of courted me all through grad school, she would write to me and say, how's the book? And please send me the book when it's ready. And I would write back to her and say, okay, I will, I'll send it, I promise. Well, I thought that if no one took this book, surely this agent would take this book. After all, we were friends, right? We had this warm correspondence for years. Well, I sent the book to her after I got these, I love you, I just don't love you enough to marry you emails. I sent the book to her, and of all of the rejections I got, that's the one that hurt me the most, because in her email to me, she said, this is nothing like I thought you were going to write. This is not the book that I'm interested in buying. The other agents had at least said, we love this book, we don't think you're quite ready, but we love it. So if you decide to revise it, here are some of the things we think you should do, but we'll leave the door open and you can send the book back. Those rejections were okay. I could deal with those. But it was the one from this agent who was supposed to be a friend that really killed me. And I got that email rejection on my birthday. And I sat down on the step and wept. Because remember, I had been working on this manuscript by that point for 10 years. 10 years of my life I had given over to trying to tell this story. Well, it turns out that that same summer, I went to a writer's residency, an artist colony. And I was going to work on the book. But I'd gotten these rejections, and I was so wounded by this. I literally could not even open the manuscript. It was actually painful for me to try to go back and look at this story. And I was in the cab driving, this residency was outside of Chicago. And I was at the residency, and I just happened to see in the cab this little article. I don't know why, but there was a magazine in the back seat of this cab I was in. And there was a little article in there that talked about this young woman, this young artist. She was a musician. And it talked about how she wasn't going to give up her fight for her art no matter what happened. She didn't know, it didn't matter how many rejections she got. She was going to keep fighting. And I was literally so tired after 10 years of writing this book that I was slumped over in the back seat of this cab. No energy, licking my wounds, feeling sorry for myself. And I read that little article and I thought, well, shit. If she can do it, I can do it. If she's not going to give up, I can't give up. So I went back. I spent another year rewriting the manuscript again. And then I gave it to a friend who had offered to submit it to her agent. And she said, let me know when it's finished. She said, I like what you've written, because I'd given her about 50 pages of the book so that when she wrote her letter of introduction to her agent, she could sound like she knew what she was talking about. So she came to me and she said, well, let me know when the book is finished. I said, what do you mean? The book is finished. She said, no, it's not really finished. Well, she had been a magazine writer. And unlike me, who'd gone through this, MFA program, she had been a magazine writer, and she really understood something different about the way books worked. So I took the book back, and I took another year, and I rewrote the book again. So now I'm on revision 13. I'd lost track. But I revised it, I sent it out, and I sent it to this one agent who I had heard she was like a bulldog. She was tough, she didn't hold hands. She was just like, she would get out there and fight for you. So I sent the book to her on the recommendation of a friend. And she called me back in 24 hours and said, I love this book. I want to represent this book. So after 11 years, thank you. So after 11 years of struggle and toil and plenty of tears, my husband will tell you, I finally was able to bring this book out into the world. And since then, it has been an amazing, amazing ride, because I've gotten to meet friends like Laura. The book was optioned by Oprah's network, Harpo, in 2011, which is another hilarious story that I'm happy to share. But we were able to, and actually they're filming now. The book is going to be a television series on Oprah's network, and they are down in Louisiana filming to this day. And it's been a wonderful ride. It's been exciting. I've had a chance to meet Ava DuVernay, who, I don't know if you know the movie Selma? Okay. Well, the young African-American writer-director Ava DuVernay, who wrote and directed that, is writing and directing Queen Sugar. So we're back in Alabama. So that's been a lot of fun, and we've had some interesting experiences with that, and it's just been a pleasure. So that's just a little bit of my story about how this all came to be. And I hope that, it sheds some light on this process, at least from one person's point of view. Because again, I think a lot of times people who aren't writers think that writers just sit down and bang out these stories. And it's not really like that. Whether it takes as long as it took me, which is 11 years, or whether it takes even 3 or 4, it's a long, long process, and it's a long journey. And you're having fun along the way, but it also, there's some pain involved too. So thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Laura.
All right, we have time for questions. Who's first? Right there. The question is, what are you both working on now?
Well, I have a new novel idea. I can't really say much about it, just because it's at that very beginning stage, but it's a novel set in New Orleans, and then I have another idea for a San Francisco novel.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I just actually finished my second novel. It's called The Wisdom of Water, unless they change the title. But it's about 2 young girls' lives whose lives collide during the Great Flood of 1927. One is a young girl whose father is Secretary of State and follows that timeline. The other is a young Cajun girl, because back then there were no bridges and no roads. The Cajuns were pretty much cut off from the world, and they didn't know what was coming. And it's a very loose retelling of the legend of Evangeline. And so I just finished it, and it's going to my agent on Monday. So hopefully it'll be published sometime next year.
Right there.
Natalie, what is your funny Oprah story?
Oh, funny. I have a good Oprah story. So in November, just a few months ago, I got an email from Ava DuVernay, right? And the email said, "Hey, Natalie, we've been working on, we want to bring you up to date on what's happening with the script and lots of changes." So she and I had this wonderful phone conversation where she told me all the things that they've done and all the characters that they've added and all these great things. And at the end of the conversation, she said, Oprah sends her regards, and she wants the 3 of us to get together before the end of the year. So I said, great, okay. So she sent me another email maybe 20 minutes after we got off the phone. And she said, call me right away. Oprah wants to know if you can come to her house on Monday. This was Saturday. So I said, okay, yes, of course. So sure enough, Oprah's people call and they make all the plane reservations, and they fly me down to Montecito, which is, just north of Los Angeles in Santa Barbara. And I am taken to Oprah's house. And the whole time, part of me is thinking, okay, this is fine. This is fine, because Oprah is she is really lovely, warm. I mean, everything that you would imagine, right? Everything that you would imagine. So we spent the day together. We walked her dogs. We did all this wonderful stuff. We had dinner. Well, right before we had dinner, we're sitting in her living room, and Nick, who is her butler / assistant / house guy, something. Oprah said, let's have some wine. So I said, okay, sure, let's have some wine. So she, calls for Nick, and Nick comes up and he said, so what would you like to have? And I said, because I'm Natalie Baszile, right, the author, not accustomed to Oprah world, I turned to him and I said, well, what do you have? And Nick looked at me like, and then he said, we have everything. And I thought, right, because this is Oprah Winfrey, and of course you have everything. Of course you have everything. And so that was the moment when I thought, okay, yeah, this is a new world I had entered. Yeah.
Wow.
That's my story.
Yeah, no kidding. What'd you have?
We had a rosé. We had a rosé. Yeah.
Okay, another question. Right back there.
After success was the first, it takes a lot of courage to start the second.
Yes, I have to tell you, when you're writing your first book, and we were talking about this earlier because someone was asking us, you have no idea what you're doing. So you just sit down there with blind faith and just start typing whatever, and sometimes think, okay, no one's going to read this. So it's like when you're doing that, you're just much more open because you don't have all these other constraints. So you're just like doing whatever you're doing. It just happened that it worked out for us. The problem with the second book, when I sat down to write it, is I felt like I had these little editors on my shoulder. After we both went through the same process. It's a very arduous, tedious process that can sometimes really get you down. So I had this little editor on my shoulder that was there, I would say, for about 3 months, and I finally made him go away. And then I, really got into the book, and I didn't worry about it because I was so confident in what I was doing that I finally didn't worry about it. But at the beginning, especially when you first sit down to write those first few pages, it's very daunting, knowing what you know now, what you didn't know then. That you kind of wish you didn't know what you knew now. But that's kind of the process.
I would also say that it's also hard because, at least in my case, I'm starting a new novel now, and it's been a decade since I have had to face a blank page with nothing on it. And I think you really do have to silence all of those voices, and you have to put away that person who wrote the first novel, and you really you have to just act on faith again, and dive in and not look around too much. You just have to try to get the words on the page. But it's tough. Starting a second book is tough.
There are 2 questions right there. We'll do with the red scarf, and then you're next.
Natalie, during those 10, 11 years of revisions, were you changing plot or character? What went into all those years of revision?
Well, definitely for those, was I changing the plot during the 10 years it took me to write the book? What was I changing? What was I revising? And a lot of times I think the story that you have in your head is not necessarily the story that's on the page. You may think things and you may see things in your mind, but what actually makes it to the page is not always the same thing. And so in my case, 2 things. Especially after I picked up that book and picked it up from rice and crawfish country and dropped it down into sugarcane country, I felt like it was the equivalent of having knit a sweater for 5 years, and then somebody comes along and pulls a thread and the whole sleeve unravels. So then you've got to go back and you've got to knit a new sleeve. And so that was a lot. A lot of my process was, changing the book so that, the characters were actually talking about sugarcane and thinking about sugarcane. It's not like in Queen Sugar, sugarcane is just in the backdrop of the story. It is very much part of what these characters are doing on a daily basis. So that was part of the revision. The other part of the revision had to do with making one character in particular more sympathetic. In the book, Charlie, the main character, she inherits this land, but she has a half-brother, Ralph Angel, who doesn't inherit anything. And so it's really the story of these 2 siblings. And a lot of the work that I had to do later on was going back and filling out Ralph Angel's character so that you really understood where he was coming from.
One very simple question, do you still have the bathrobe?
The question was, does she still have the bathrobe?
Yes. And I still ride in that bathroom.
The second question was, it sounds like
in New Orleans, Louisiana. Do you see yourself as staying there for your writing purposes, or do you think you'll move to different parts of the country at some point?
I can't hear.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but she was stating that both of your books are set in New Orleans. And do you anticipate staying in New Orleans as far as your book settings go?
Well, my next book actually is not set in New Orleans. It's set on it's set all over Louisiana, on both sides of the Mississippi, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, on the River Road and on the other side, because of the Great Flood, which basically took place the whole year of 1927 and part of 1926. But the question has been asked, both of this novel and the first novel, will you do sequels to your novels? I hadn't considered that for Doll Baby, although people keep asking me that. And as far as this new book, it definitely will lead probably to a sequel for that one. But the other question I get often is, will you always write about the South? And will you always write about New Orleans? And what happened to me after Katrina was, even though I said I thought I knew a lot about my state, I realized there was so much that I didn't know. And so that was my goal, to learn as much as I could. And the other reason I wrote about the Great Flood is that I realized, well, since I know about flood, I know what it feels like, smells like, I know what the aftermath is like, I know what the people are feeling. I felt like I could really get my soul into these characters and what was going on. But will I always write about the South? I don't know. I'd like to write about a lot of things. So hopefully 10 years from now, you can ask me the same question. We'll see.
More questions?
Natalie, can you describe the first time you actually took a bite into some sugar cane?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It was wonderful. It was that same weekend that I was at my friend's birthday. And, we're standing in the middle of this field. And, her family owns some sugarcane, lots of sugarcane land, about 2,000 acres, actually. Yeah. So, later on that weekend, somebody brought me stuff. Because, the funny thing was, as soon as I decided that this novel was going to be set in this region of South Louisiana, I was adopted by all, South Louisianans. And that was one of the things that I was so really grateful for, was how generous people were and how much people were really rooting for me, and really just took me in and showed me this way of life that I didn't know, And so that first taste of sugarcane, I remember biting in, and it was sweet, and then, the juice kind of floods your mouth, and it's pulpy. It's wonderful. It was wonderful. Yes. Yeah. It was great. Yeah.
More questions?
Natalie, once one learns to appreciate sugarcane, the next step, I think, is you enjoy rum.
Yes, definitely.
Pardon me? He didn't ask a question. He just was commenting that the next step from enjoying sugarcane would be to enjoying rum.
Yes.
Right. Is Oprah going to be in your movie?
I thought until last week, they were thinking that she would have some kind of recurring role. And then just on Friday, I saw an announcement that said that she is not. She's one of the co-producers, and she was actually on the set. My husband and I they were filming in Los Angeles last week, and typical thing, right? Last Monday, I got an email saying, Ava would like to invite you to the set on Friday. So, of course, I had to drop everything and fly down there, and she had been on the set the day before, just, watching the action. So I missed her by a day, and she's not, to my knowledge, she does not have a role.
Right up there.
Can you tell us anything about the casting?
Question is about casting.
Can I tell you about the casting? Well, it's interesting. You know, I don't know how many of you were here last night to hear Eric Larson, or actually even Craig Johnson today, and he was talking about how, you know, once it becomes a Hollywood thing, it's different from the book. And so they have hired this woman. I don't know if we have any True Blood fans in the audience. Any True Blood fans? Okay. Well, there's a woman, if you know True Blood, it's an HBO series. Tara from True Blood is now going to be one of the main characters in this. They have a guy, something Vaughn, who's in Days of Our Lives. Do you know? I don't know. So yeah, they have all of these new actors who are appearing. I can't. I'm blanking on the names right now, but yeah, they've hired the cast, and they've already moved from LA down to New Orleans, and they were filming all last week.
Red sweater.
Can you talk a little bit about your writing process? Like when you sit down, do you write page 1 all the way to the end, or do you know the end, or that kind of thing?
Question is about the writing process and if they start and
Well, I can tell you, for both my books, because there was so much research involved in it, and especially with Doll Baby, because Fanny bets on sports, and I didn't know anything about sports, really. So I was reading the newspapers from 1964 to figure out what she would be betting on each day. I had to follow that. So every night before I would go to write, it basically would be like I would be studying. You know, I would study my notes, I would study the newspaper, because I don't like to be interrupted when I'm writing. I mean, I like to just sit there and get in what they call the zone and not keep stopping, you know, to look things up. So that was my process, that every night I would be like studying for a test, and then I would go the next morning and just sit there and already know. I never sit down at a blank stream thinking, what am I going to write today? I mean, when I sit down, I already know what I think I'm going to write. And when I wrote Doll Baby, I decided, why I did it in 3 months, that I was going to go from the beginning to end without stopping, without going back to edit, you know, without going back to do anything, because I wanted to get it down on paper. This time when I did it, I would go back for what I had written the day before and edit it, and that would get my brain started to what I needed to write that day. But I never sit down not knowing. I've never had writer's block to sit down. Usually it's that they're you know, it's going in my head so quickly that I can't get it down on the computer in time. But
for me, you know, I think part of it is showing up every day, because I think the hardest thing about writing is if you step away, at least in my case, if I step away for too long, then I can't hear the story anymore. You know, you lose the rhythm of it, and that's agonizing. So it's better to just do it every day, and it's like exercising a muscle, and you're always kind of in there with the story. So we have 2 girls who are now grown, but when I started this book, you know, I would take them to the bus stop, they'd get on the bus, and much like Laura, it was back at the desk. And you know, that's the way I would spend my days as much as I could, was just staying in the work. And I do tend to be fairly linear, so I do tend to start at the beginning and then work all the way through. And then for the next revision, go back to the beginning and make another pass.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, the one question we usually get is, do you outline or do you not outline your novel? Like, I know Eric Larson probably has very detailed outlines on his novel, but I probably have an outline in my head. I mean, I know from beginning to end what's going to happen, and because Doll Baby was so character-driven, I let them drive the story. So I didn't actually sit down to write an outline, nor did I, well, I was going to say, nor did I for the second book. I had to write a timeline for what was happening in the Great Flood. But for Doll Baby, literally, I let the stories tell the character, and what what I thought was going to happen to some of them changed along the way because of their interactions with each other. They literally start talking to you in your head. I mean, it's so bad you'll be at a cocktail party and be like, excuse me, I have to go 1 second. And I would go with my phone, okay, right down. And then I would come back and they're like, okay, yeah, she has gone nuts, okay. But
Okay, now one more question. Okay.
You said that the school now has a copy of your book in the section of those authors who went to our school. Have you gone back to the school to talk to the other students to maybe inspire them?
Yes, that's a funny story. They did ask me to come back, and I was up on stage, in front of this high school audience. I was like, how am I going to talk to this high school audience, about this story? But the gentleman that was introducing me was actually at the school at the same time I was. He was a couple years older, and he introduced me as a polymath. And I'm like, what's a polymath? I don't even know what that is. I had to go look it up later. But it means someone who's multi-talented, because when I was younger, I was an AAU swimmer, and he knew that. And I was actually training for the Olympics when I decided to retire. So I've always, had that drive, I guess, to do something. So he was paying me a big compliment. I just didn't know what the word meant. So yes, I spoke in front of the students at Country Day, and half of them are out there going, I thought, okay, they're so bored, this is terrible. Until all these mothers came back later and told me, my daughter told me you were so great up there. And I'm like, oh, thank God, thank you. Okay, good.
Yeah.